Hello everybody, I'm Dr. Urvashi Sharma, Associate Professor, Department of Journalism and Mass Communication, Jagannath University, Jaipur. We are continuing our series on driving force of freedom struggle where we look at the contribution of the famous leaders towards journalism and freedom movement. So in this session we'll be looking at the contributions made by Lala Lajpat Rai, Jawaharlal Nehru, S. Sadanand, and Robert Knight. So let's begin with Lala Lajpat Rai. So who was Lala Lajpat Rai? Lala Lajpat Rai was a prominent journalist and an Indian freedom fighter. He was one of the members who founded Indian Home League of America in 1917. He published Young India and he was the editor. After this, the name Young India was taken up by Mahatma Gandhi to publish his weekly from India. He, as a journalist, collaborated with Madan Mohan Malviya and Raja Narendra Nath to publish Hindustan Times. Lalaji and Lala Hansraj started newspaper Punjabi from Lahore. He also established various self-help groups with the motto of self empowerment, right? The policy of the paper was generally guided and controlled by Lalaji. So let us look at the life of Lalaji. Lalaji was born in 1865 in Monga district of Punjab to a middle class family. He was a lawyer by profession. He is also known as Punjab Kesari. Lalaji was influenced by Swami Dayanand Saraswati and he joined Arya Samaj in Lahore. He believed that the ideals of Indian culture combined with nationalism will lead to a establishment of secular state. So he was a supporter of secular state. Along with Bipin Chandra Pal, Bal Gangadhar Tilak, they formed a trio Lal Bal Pal of the extremist leaders. He was also involved with Hindu Mahasabha and he fought against untouchability. He further joined Indian National Congress and participated in many political agitations in Punjab. For his political agitation, he was deported to Burma without trial in 1907 but returned after a few months because of lack of evidence. He was against the partition of Bengal and founded Home Rule League of America in 1917 in New York. In USA, he worked to get moral support for the Indian independence movement from international community. He was also elected the president of All India Trade Union Congress. He supported non-cooperation movement of Gandhiji at Nagpur session of the Congress in 1920. He protested against Rowlatt Act and Jallianwala Bagh massacre that followed. He was the editor of Arya Gazette, which he had founded. He founded Servants of People Society in 1921. He co-founded the Punjab National Bank in 1894. He was elected deputy leader of the Central Legislative Assembly in 1926. In 1928, he moved a resolution in the Assembly refusing cooperation with the Simon Commission since the Commission had no Indian members. He was leading a silent protest against Simon Commission in Lahore where he was brutally lathi charged by Superintendent of Police James Scott. Rai died after sustaining the injuries for few weeks. Now we have had a look at his political career and his contribution. Let us how look at the journalistic life of Lala Lajpat Rai. So Lala Lajpat Rai started an Urdu daily Vande Mataram from Lahore, which boasted a huge circulation of 5,000 copies. The issue of 10th May 1927 was confiscated by the police and he had to appeal in the High Court against this. Four editors of the newspaper were sent to jail under the charges of sedition. He also supported monthly paper Adhikar as a patron. His paper was the mouthpiece of India-wide committee for uplifting untouchables so that the untouchability can be eliminated from the Indian society. Lalaji took out a weekly newspaper, People from Lahore. He himself was the editor of this paper. It was the mouthpiece of the Servants' People Society that encouraged the youth for service towards the nation. This paper rose due to Lalaji's clear, fearless political comments, stable language, and balanced editorship. So, let us look at some of the achievements of Lalaji. Lala Lajpat Rai was a prominent leader in the Indian independence movement. During late 19th and early 20th century, he played a significant role in Indian National Congress, the Hindu Mahasabha and Arya Samaj. He was a writer and a journalist and his work included The Story of My Deportation and Unhappy India. One of Lala Lajpat Rai's key achievement was his role in non-corporation movement of 1920 to 1922. This movement was led by Mahatma Gandhi, which aimed to resist British rule in India through non-violent means. Lalaji was a strong supporter of this movement and he played a crucial role in organizing it in Punjab region. He also helped to establish the Indian National College in Lahore, which provided education to young Indians and helped to promote nationalist ideas. Another important achievement of Lala Lajpat Rai was his work to promote the rights of the farmers and workers in India. He was a strong advocate for the rights of the rural people and he worked to improve the living conditions of the farmer and rural laborers. He also supported the rights of industrial workers and helped to establish trade unions, labor organizations in Punjab region. Lalaji was also an important figure in the Hindu nationalist movement in India. He was a member of Hindu Mahasabha and he worked to promote Hindu identity and culture in India. He also advocated rights of the Hindu community and sought to protect it from discrimination. Lala Lajpat Rai was also an advocate of education and women's rights. He was a founder of Dayanand Anglo-Vedic DAV College Trust and Management Society, which established number of colleges and schools in India. He also supported education of women and worked to promote rights of women in India. Lalaji's contribution to Indian freedom struggle is not limited to the above mentioned points. He was also an active promoter in the ideas of Swadeshi, boycotting foreign goods, encouraging use of indigenous products, and was also actively involved in Indian National Congress and was a member of its working committee. In 1928, Lala Lajpat Rai, leading a peaceful protest against the Simon Commission, a British government commission that was tasked with reviewing the political situation in India. The protest turned violent and Lalaji was severely beaten by British police. He died from his injuries on November 17, 1928. Lalaji's death was a turning point in the Indian independence movement and his sacrifice for the cause of Indian freedom is still remembered today. He is remembered as a hero of Indian people and a symbol of resistance against British rule. Lalaji's political activism and leadership were instrumental in Indian independence movement and his legacy continues to inspire Indians to this day. He was a strong advocate of rights of farmers and workers and fought tirelessly to improve their living conditions. He also worked to improve the education system in India and was vocal critique of the British government policies towards India. His contribution to Indian independence movement have been recognized by many, and he is remembered as a true patriot who sacrificed his life for the freedom of his country. Lala Rajpat Rai, the Lion of Punjab, was a true leader who dedicated his life to the cause of the Indian freedom. He was a political activist, lawyer, and writer who fought for the rights of the Indian and worked tirelessly to end British rule in India. His legacy continues to inspire the Indians and will always be remembered as a hero of Indian people. Lala Lajpat Rai's death was a tragic loss for the Indian independent movement, but his sacrifice has not gone in vain. His legacy lives on through countless people who continue to fight for the rights of the Indian people and for Indian independence. Lala Lajpat Rai was a symbol to be remembered as a true leader and a symbol of resistance against British rule. Lala Lajpat Rai's words still ring true. The nation is greater than the individual. Service of the nation is supreme duty of the individual. He will and always be remembered as a true patriot who sacrificed his life for the motherland. Now let us look at Jawaharlal Nehru as a journalist. Indeed, Nehru began his early career as a journalist, in fact, a journalist crusader campaigning for the freedom struggle as a Congress leader. Later, though many of his books became bestsellers, he did not claim to be a writer. Nehru, like Gandhi, was for the times a great journalist, in fact, journalist come activist for the freedom struggle. Later, Nehru took much interest in press because he felt that it had a role to play in national life after independence and also in support of a policy of non-alignment and struggles for the developing world. Similarly, his discovery of India was till recently considered important reading material for students studying history. Freedom of press was a part of democratic process for him, and he accepted that criticism, even if it was strong and intolerant, was a part of it. He often not only tolerated criticism but appreciated it. If the level was high, what upset him were malice, lack of dignity, or ignorance of history. But overall, he upheld the principles of free press even when he did not often respect the sections of the press for not being equal to high standards he expected out of them. He, as one of his admirers and himself an editor, Chalapati Rao said in his book on Nehru, for him, freedom of press consisted essentially of editorial freedom and not of freedom of the owner of the press. He disliked press barons of all kind, and post-war developments in the Indian press oppressed him so much that he took interest in the appointment of press commission. Nehru was fully aware of the role of newspaper proprietor and conflict that occur with the exercise of press freedom. Therefore, addressing the AINEC against AINEC on September 17, 1952, he felt that the money, the owner, and proprietor are major factor. Does the freedom of press ultimately mean the freedom of rich man to do what he likes with his money through the press? So it may be that the freedom of the writer to write what he will, but rather of the owner of a newspaper to see that the writer writes something that he wants him to write. Therefore, freedom of press may come to mean freedom of persons who have knack of making money. One of the most notable aspects of Nehru's multidimensional personality was that he himself was a journalist. Before independence, he contributed to many newspapers as journalist. While interacting with press, he submitted that I ought to have been journalist instead of what I am. He said, I think that if I had no other job in life, I should have turned to journalism. In the present endeavor, Nehru's view on press will be examined in two historical phases. The phases when he worked as a journalist, and the second phase is when he became the Prime Minister of India. While as a journalist, he strongly advocated for the freedom of press. Later, as Prime Minister, he expressed his distress with the working of the press in the development of India as a country of his dreams. In his autobiography, he has discussed in great length the press of his time. Nehru started his journalism with his contribution in the newspaper named The Independent. This newspaper was established by his father, Pandit Motilal Nehru, in 1910. We have discussed this in the earlier session. This was the period of freedom struggle of India, and Nehru participated in it on the ground as well as through his writings. In his writings, he was strong advocate of civil liberties and freedom of press. Civil liberties are fundamental rights of the people. In his view, people should be allowed to express their opinions by speech or writing. If civil liberties are suppressed, the nation loses all vitality and becomes impotent for anything substantial. In his vision, the right of civil liberty is the right to criticize or oppose the government. Later on, in 1938, Nehru started his own newspaper named the National Herald. The paper was banned by British during Quit India movement. Nehru was very much aware of the importance of the press in interacting with public. He started writing in the newspaper for freedom of press and India. Uh, as a leader, as a leader imbued with rich sense of history, Jawaharlal Nehru, more than any mainstream Congress leader, recognized the press question, the anti-imperialist freedom-loving content and spirit that made it take wing and become a competent part of democratic India. During freedom struggle, journalism was a by mission for freedom struggle, and it was not practiced to earn livelihood only. Journalists propagated the freedom of the country and expressed their views to the masses. The tone of the press was violent, and journalists were motivated by high ideals of national independence. The Indian press unitedly acted to support freedom struggle. The British government realized the influence of the press and promulgated several repressive measures to curtail the freedom of press via Vernacular Press Act 1878, Press Emergency Power Act 1931, Special Power Ordinance 1932. Nehru was not in favor of Press and Emergency Powers Act. Nehru, in his writings, strongly opposed the repressive measures and argued that I am against the suppression of news as it would deprive public of sorry uh, he said I am against suppression of news as it would deprive public of the only means of forming correct judgment on the world events. Before independence, most of the press was in the hands of journalist owners with scarce finances and very low budget. Newspaper printing was not lucrative business. Rather, it was strongly stood by the side of the press against the repressive measures of British government. In his opinion, the fight for freedom of the press is a part and parcel of freedom struggle. He therefore appealed to the masses. The question of freedom of press is a vital question, and inevitably the brunt of the light must fall upon the journalist, but the general public must take their fair share in it. He appealed the public for support to build pressure on the British Raj in favor of freedom of expression. So we see that Nehruji had a very progressive idea. He was in for the freedom of press. He wanted press to be free so that it can act as a watchdog of society. It can condemn and appreciate the policies and the programs of the government so as to give a clear view to the people so that the public can form a mindset and act accordingly. So, Matthew Arnold once he described that journalism is a literature in hurry, but for Nehru, journalism was a political action. It was an expression of what was going around in the world so that the people, the public, can make a judgment and can act accordingly. Nehru had immense respect for the press freedom, and it was the reason why, after quitting the editorship of National Herald, he never intervened in the functioning of the paper. Now we move to S. Sadanand. So S. Sadanand is remembered as a fearless freedom fighter and a brilliant editor. He inspired the whole generation of journalists. S. Sadanand also started Tamil daily Damini in 1934. In 1933, he bought the Indian Express from Varadarajalu Naidu. The ownership of the paper was later handed over to Ramanath Goenka. But Sadanand is mostly remembered as a proprietor and editor of Free Press of India, a nationalist news agency founded in 1927, and the Free Press Journal, the daily newspaper in English that was established in 1930 and published from Mumbai. Reuters, the British news agency, enjoyed a monopoly in news collection and distribution process. It was not interested in reporting news of the freedom struggle. Many Indian leaders felt that a British controlled organization would never reflect the Congress points and views accurately to the outside world. Hence, a strong need was felt to start an independent news agency with a nationalist bent of mind. So the man who translated this idea into reality or converted the dream to reality was S. Sadanand, who had served for some years with the Reuters. Thus, Free Press of India was born on 1927. The British government came down with a heavy hands on this news agency. Free Press of India telegrams were subjected to strict censorship, and many newspapers were pressurized not to subscribe or publish news which was supplied by the agency. Sadanand had to close down the agency eventually because there was lack of funds, and then the British Indian government prosecuted him under the press law and convicted him in 1930. On a number of occasions, monetary securities were demanded, and he had lost a substantial amount of money. In 1930, he founded the Free Press Journal, which actively supported the freedom struggle movement. The Free Press Journal was for the series of launchpad for the series of journalists in India like Bal Thackeray, R.K. Lakshman, T.G.S. George were some of the former employees of Free Press Journal. S. Sadanand never went to college and was a self-taught journalist. J.K. Singh calls him a great journalist but a poor business manager. Rangaswamy Prathasthe calls him an able editor, an innovator, and a fearless patriot. He died at the age of 53 in 1953. So this was a brief about S. Sadanand. Let's look at his contributions. So S. Sadanand was a founder, editor, and the proprietor of the Free Press Journal, and he started Damini, a Tamil daily broadsheet. So he was the eldest son of the late Mr. C.V. Swaminathan Iyer, editor of a well-known formal Tamil weekly Viveka Chintamani. Educated in Madras City, entered journalism in 1917. He was in the thick of the politics right from the start of his career and was signatory to the pledge against the Rowlatt Act. As a publicity officer of the Indian National Congress for a while, he looked after khadi and village industries. He worked in Reuters in 1920 and later became the assistant editor of the Independent Allahabad, which was started by Motilal Nehru. He then migrated to Rangoon Times. He always had a desire to own his own news agency because he always thought that the news agencies that were there at that time, like Reuters, were only publicizing the good deeds of the British government and never the struggle of the Indian people, and the policies and the ideology of the Congress were brought to light to the outside world. So, in order to highlight what was the ideology and the state of the country, he wanted to start a news agency which had a nationalistic ideology and a bent of mind. Free Press Agency or Free Press News Service. In a bid to counter the pro-British propaganda of Reuters and Associated Press, which meant that they were only showing the uh, putting up the good face of the British government or the British Empire, right? The only news agencies that were working internationally in India those days. Sadanand started his Free Press News Service in 1927. He said that the public opinion was molded entirely by news supplied on day-to-day basis, and it was difficult, if not impossible, to mold healthy public opinion owing to the monopoly held in the supply of news by subsidized news agencies. So, Free Press Agency telegrams were subjected to strict censorship because the Britishers did not want a news agency to flourish, because it would then give ideas to others also to come up with a news agency, and it would spread like a wildfire just like vernacular press, and would increase the reach and visibility of the news agencies and newspapers to the outside world. So, the strict censorship was imposed, and newspaper were made British government made sure that newspapers do not subscribe to them or publish the stories which were given to the newspapers by the Free Press News Service. So newspapers grew reluctant to publish the news supplied by Free Press Agency. So after all these strict rules which are implied like censorship to the news supplied by Free Press News Services or Free Press News Agency, the newspapers were also being reluctant in publishing the news supplied by Free Press News Agency. So after Free Press Agency faced a very strict censorship, S. Sadanand started his Free Press Journal as a morning daily newspaper in June 1930 from Bombay. Now, S. Sadanand later took over Indian Express in 1932 from Dr. P. Vardarujulu Naidu and conducted it as a newspaper of the Free Press Journal Group. In 1935, his newspaper securities were confiscated and S. Sadanand had to close down his agency, but his newspaper continued. Now let us look at the contributions made by Robert Knight. So Robert Knight was an English editor, journalist and a newspaper proprietor. He was considered a critic of British imperialism. Knight was the editor of the Times of India and founded the Statesman. Both are the prominent newspapers in India. Robert Knight was born in London in 1847. He came to Bombay in British India as a 22-year-old. Later, he took up journalism and writing articles in newspaper. Robert Knight became editor of the Bombay Times in 1857, replacing George Buist. In December 1859, the Bombay Standard and Chronicle of Western India was absorbed into it. In 1861, it absorbed its rival Courier and the Telegraph, both Bombay newspapers, and the name was changed to the Times of India. It grew into a national prominence under him. He forged an arrangement with Reuters which made them the sole agent for India. Later he left Times of India and started The Statesman in Calcutta. In 1854 he married Catherine Henna, with whom he had 12 children. He died in Calcutta in 1890, apparently of malaria. His sons Paul Robert were also a journalist and newspaper proprietors. So this was all a brief about the life of Robert Knight. Now let us look at the contributions in detail. So Robert Knight was an English editor, journalist and newspaper proprietor. He is considered as a critique of British imperialism because he wrote about the British policies and programs which were unjust. He was the editor of Times of India and he founded Statesman. Both the newspapers are the prominent newspapers of the country. Let us now look at his journalistic contribution. Knight, whose writing skill and passion as a reformer were more than made up for his lack of formal education as a journalist. He was instrumental in nurturing a vibrant national newspaper industry in British India and for Indian nationals. Knight fought for a press free of prior restraint or intimidation, whether it be through the efforts of the government, business interest, or cultural forces. Although he began as a less of a critique of colonial rule than the penalties and incompetencies of the imperial officials, he continued disillusion hardened his views in his later life. He was an inauspicious arrival in Bombay in 1847 at a 22-year-old. Knight was a son of bank clerk from a lower middle class in South London neighborhood, and his life was a chipper before he benefited from family friend with a job in Bombay as an agent for London wine merchant in the first series of unsuccessful business opportunity. To make end meet, Knight wrote articles for local newspapers, a necessity after marrying custom official's daughter and starting a family of 12 children. He sidelined his sideline became a career when he filled in for vacationing in Bombay Times as an editor in 1857. The indigenous newspaper industry that Knight thrust himself into in mid-19th century India consisted of motley small circulation daily or weekly sheets printed on rickety presses. Few extended beyond their small communities and seldom drew together the desperate mix of caste, tribe, and regional subculture of contemporary India. The media were more often dominated by Anglo-Indian presses, which promoted purely British interest. Knight, in impassioned fashion, recognized the void to be filled. When Sepoy Mutiny exploded, Knight broke with the rest of the Anglo-Indian press and decried Indian savagery and instead blamed the violence on the lack of discipline and poor leadership in the army. Unpopular with Anglo community, Knight's critique struck a chord with the Times' Indian stakeholders and he was quickly made editor permanently. Knight continued to critique the mismanagement and geared of the British Raj, annexation policies and inappropriated native lands and arbitrary imposed taxes on previously exempted land titles, ridiculous income taxes and educational system that disregarded Indian customs and need. While some accused Knight of sympathy to his Indian bosses, Hirschman instead seized the moral indignation of one whose own experience as a social outsider had led to ingrained sympathy for the disadvantaged and disgust for the duplicities of the British rule. Knight led the Times to national prominence. In 1860, he bought out the Indian shareholders and merged with the rivals Bombay Standard while starting India's first news agency and becoming India's agent for Reuters news service. In 1861, he changed the name from Bombay Times and Standard to Times of India. 7 years later, business quarrels led him to sell his shares to his Times of India partners and launched a new venture, a periodical called The Indian Economist, that focused on financial news. 2 years later, he returned to journalism by founding The Star of India, an ill-fated diversion into government job conducting statistical survey prompted his relocation to Calcutta, but his continued contrariness with governmental authorities through his journalism quickly sparked conflicts of interest with the government that led to a continuous dismissal. Forced back to full-time editorship of Statesman, Knight quickly built on a worthy rival of Calcutta Anglo-Indian dailies, the Englishman and the Indian Daily News. He kept up his advocacy for Indian causes and mocked the British invasions of Afghanistan in 1878 as expansionism and empire's hiding of the feminines occurring in the northern frontier. His reporting embarrassed the government to retaching up its relief effort. By 1879, Knight returned to England disgusted by the Conservative policies and sought to affect British public opinion. The Weekly London Statesman denounced the British Raj's expensive and morally bankrupt hypocrisy in exploiting India and fomenting a war with Afghanistan. As hard as he tried ever, Knight's London statement was not sustainable concern. Though he mortgaged his stake in Calcutta Statesman to stay afloat, both papers succumbed to financial strains. The Calcutta Statesman was rescued by Pikpara family, one of the Bengal's largest landed interest. Knight's story is unfamiliar to many in the field of imperial studies and media history. As Hirschman suggests, this was likely not inevident. Knight's prickly personality and flagrant antipathy for the British Raj ensured that he was not to receive prominence in the accounts of British India or Empire. So he was the one who was writing against the British rule, who was bringing to light the policies and the programs of the British, and he is credited to come to an agreement with Reuters, which made him the sole agent of Reuters in India. So this was all about the uh, contributions made by the prominent leaders and the prominent thinkers towards the nationalist movement and also journalism. So, if we analyze the entire thing, we can see that the focus of Lalaji's newspaper was to mobilize the youth towards national service and eradication of untouchability. S. Sadanand, on the other hand, came up with free press news service in order to fill up a void which represented that the agency at that time, both Reuters and Associated Press, was covering and propagating the British interest. So, in order to come up with a true picture of the country or the colony, S. Sadanand came up with a news agency. He said that public opinion was molded entirely by the news supplied on day-to-day basis. Knight, on the other hand, being the editor of Times of India and founder of Statesman, both of them were the prominent newspapers in India. Robert Knight had become an editor after replacing George Buist, but he was also for the freedom of press. He was also for the liberty and freedom of speech and expression through press. He also made sure the content in his newspaper or the stories which were covered in his newspaper gave true pictures to the people, so that they can come to a justified position, they can justify their action. So we see that all the nationalist movements, all the nationalist leaders, all the thinkers were of the view that the newspaper should be such which depicts truth, which through accuracy, balanced reporting, objectivity. At the same time, newspaper of those times were the vehicles to put across the ideology of a person who has started the newspaper. The belief of the person were taken forward, so the editorials had to be very motivating, they have to be very fiery, so that they can ignite a sense of nationalism and pride amongst the youth, right? At the same time, it was also realized that the true picture of the country was not depicted to the outside world, so a press agency was needed, a news agency was needed. The void was filled by S. Sadanand. Robert Knight also identified this, but he entered into a contract with the Reuters and became the sole, say, proprietor or the sole partner of Reuters in the country. Thank you.